Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. If you're a new faculty member just starting out on your teaching journey, or hey, even if you're returning and just looking to freshen up your approach, consider me your personal, incredibly enthusiastic mentor for the day. Stepping into the classroom for the very first time is so exciting, but let's be real. We all know what comes with those classic first-year challenges, especially when we're trying to figure out how to actually reach every single student. Well, today we're going to tackle those challenges head-on. We'll be exploring the powerful frameworks behind culturally responsive and inclusive teaching, and we're going to build a completely practical, actionable toolkit that you can use on day one.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our totally practical roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll cover equity versus equality. Then, designing inclusive learning, followed by accountable conversations. After that, we'll talk about addressing classroom harm, and finally, we'll wrap up with your equity action plan.
Section 1, Equity versus Equality, the Mindset Shift.
So before we even think about designing a syllabus or stepping up to the podium, we absolutely have to shift our fundamental mindset. This is basically the bedrock of inclusive teaching. Often, as new teachers, our very first instinct is to aim for absolute equality, right? We think, well, to be fair, I must give every student the exact same support, the exact same instruction, and the exact same testing conditions. But actually, true fairness in the classroom requires a shift toward equity. Equity is all about providing unique, differentiated support based on individual student needs. Think about it like this. If you give every student the exact same scaffolded worksheet, sure, that's equality, but it might not be what every student actually needs to succeed. Equity means recognizing that during a test, for example, fairness might look like providing extra time, a reader, or a modified paper for a student with specific needs. It's really about leveling the playing field, not just standardizing the equipment.
And that brings us to this absolutely beautiful and honestly essential concept. Pupils deserve windows and mirrors just like everyone else. This metaphor is a brilliant touchstone for selecting your course materials. So, mirrors allow students to see themselves reflected in your curriculum. Their identities, their lived experiences, their cultures, and their challenges are visibly valued. Windows, on the other hand, allow students to see into the lives of others, which is exactly how we build empathy, inclusion, and a much broader worldview. As a new faculty member, curating a reading list that gives your students both windows and mirrors is literally one of the most impactful things you can do.
Section 2, Designing Inclusive Learning, Universal Design for Learning. Let's see how this mindset builds directly into how we construct the actual course itself. We're moving from theory to design, using a fantastic framework called Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. I want you to really think about this question. How can students show what they know? I want to challenge you to think totally beyond the traditional midterm and final exam. Students differ drastically in how they communicate their understanding. If we only test them using one single modality, like a high-stakes written test, we aren't necessarily measuring their knowledge, are we? We might just be measuring their ability to take a written test. UDL asks us to provide multiple means of action and expression.
Let's look at some really fun, specific examples of how you can offer multiple modes for student expression. Now, you don't have to completely abandon traditional essays, but you can definitely expand the menu. For example, some educators are using digital board games for students to demonstrate historical knowledge. Or how about digital escape rooms to analyze poetry? In a theater class, instead of a standard research paper on playwright August Wilson, a summative project could involve small groups modernizing a specific scene in the style of Hamilton. These are authentic learning activities that reflect real student life and interests, while absolutely maintaining rigorous academic standards.
Section 3, Accountable Conversations, Navigating Complex Dialogue. Facilitating complex or challenging discussions is often the hardest part of the job. And now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it transitions us to a new framework for handling that.
We constantly hear the term safe space or brave space, right? But honestly, those terms can be a bit problematic. Promising complete 100% safety is just impossible. And asking for bravery can place this totally inequitable, exhausting burden on marginalized students who are already facing daily microaggressions. So instead, we want to cultivate an accountable space. This is a learning environment where participants are explicitly responsible for their intentions, their words, their actions, and their reactions. It puts the onus on everyone to practice self-regulation and to lean into some productive discomfort. So how do we actually pull this off? First things first, assess your own preparedness. If a highly complex social issue comes up and you aren't quite ready to facilitate a productive dialogue, it is perfectly okay to pause and redirect the conversation to a later date. Second, co-create discussion norms with your students in week 1. Ask them, what are our rules of engagement? Third, and this is such a great tip, Use digital platforms like Mentimeter or Padlet. These tools allow for anonymous student participation. This significantly lowers the barrier for students to share their thoughts on really tense topics, helping you engage voices you might never hear from otherwise.
Section 4. Addressing classroom harm when things go wrong. Okay, let's just take a collective breath here. Because as your mentor, I've got to be straight with you. Mistakes will happen. Boundaries will be crossed. Harmful statements will accidentally, or even intentionally, be made in your classroom. We use a really effective technique here called pause and pivot. When harm occurs, you've got to acknowledge it immediately. Ignoring it, that just erodes trust instantly. You basically have two main tools here, calling out and calling in. Calling out is when you literally hit the pause button to explicitly state that words or actions are unacceptable. For example, I need to pause here. You're making assumptions that are harmful. Calling in, on the other hand, is shifting the moment from a mere reaction into critical reflection. It's about pulling the student into mutual learning to help them understand why what they said had a negative impact without just completely shutting them down.
So the crucial point is how you frame your response shapes your entire classroom culture. Let's compare these frameworks. A punitive framework relies heavily on punishment just to maintain order, but it never actually resolves the underlying cause. We highly recommend moving toward restorative and transformative frameworks instead. Restorative methods seek to mitigate the impact of actions and restore relationships to where they were. Transformative frameworks go even deeper. They aim to transform the entire situation and address underlying struggles or power imbalances. This requires a really strong set of community agreements, which is exactly why we co-create them early on.
Section 5. Your Equity Action Plan, the Practical Roadmap.
Wow, we have covered a ton of ground today, right? Everything from mindset to crisis management. Now, let's empower you with a practical roadmap to assess your own teaching methods for any equity gaps. You can actually do this classroom inclusivity audit using a standard course design template. Step 1. Review your learning outcomes. Ask yourself, do they encourage students to explore diverse perspectives? Step 2. Assess your teaching methods. Are you relying entirely on lectures, or are you incorporating collaborative instruction? Step 3. Analyze your assessments. Are you offering multiple modalities, just like we discussed with UDL? And finally, step 4. Identify the specific components that need revision and just tackle them one by one. To make all of this super manageable, here's a practical schedule for your first year. Before the semester even starts, do your syllabus audit. Check for your windows and mirrors. Then, during week 1, co-create those community agreements to start building your accountable space. At mid-semester, check in by collecting anonymous student feedback. Ask them point blank, do you feel seen, heard, and supported? And post-semester, reflect on that feedback and build a community of practice with your fellow new faculty members to share what worked and, hey, what didn't.
And this brilliantly illustrates our ultimate goal. Culturally responsive teaching isn't some rigid checklist you complete once and file away in a drawer. Instead, it is a continuous, dynamic cycle of reflection and feedback. By constantly analyzing your instruction, monitoring student progress, and tweaking your methods, you are actively dismantling barriers and profoundly impacting diverse student success.
To wrap up, I want to leave you with this final, really vital question to kickstart your inclusive teaching journey. Look at the materials you've prepared for your upcoming classes, look at the authors, look at the perspectives, and ask yourself, whose voice is missing from your syllabus right now? Identifying who has been left out is the very first critical step toward bringing them in. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and absolute best of luck in your classroom. You're going to do great.